Good afternoon and welcome everybody. For today's session, awarding three excellent journalists for their work on religion and the public sphere. Hi, my name is Evan Barry. I sit on the Committee for the Public Understanding of Religion, which is the part of the AAR institution that is charged with picking awardees for the Journalism Award. I'd like to thank two anonymous reviewers for helping me and Marion Pierre to serve as the journalists, or as the jury for the awardees. And I would like to invite Kelsey Dallas up to present the third place award. We give lovely certificate and a small check.
Thank you.
So Kelsey is a national correspondent at Deseret News. The jury was impressed with her work on U.S.-Vatican relations, Sikh Americans serving in the U.S. Armed Forces, and Christian conservative legal movements in the United States. All the pieces that constituted her submission demonstrate a real journalistic range and an ability to see into the interesting corners of religion in American public life. Jack Jenkins is our second place awardee. Congratulations, Jack. Jack Jenkins is a national correspondent at Religion News Service. The jury was impressed with his submission, which was a series of interlinked, feature-length articles on Christian nationalism in the Trump era. These were written with a fluency in theological concepts that is smartly integrated with journalistic voice. Daniel Burke is this year's first place winner. Daniel is the chief religion correspondent at CNN. He's been recognized many times for his excellent journalistic work, including his receipt of multiple awards from the Religion News Association. His submissions for this year's award concerned debates over the concept of evil, the proposed move of the U.S. Embassy in Israel to Jerusalem, the Roy Moore Senate campaign, and the religious background of Supreme Court Justice Neil Gorsuch. In all cases, his reporting was humane, was clear, and well-sourced, and is just the tip of the iceberg of a really excellent body of work over a long time. So congratulations to all three of this year's awardees. Thank you. So I'd like to turn things over to my colleague on the Committee for the Public Understanding of Religion, Asma Afsruddin, who will be moderating today's conversation. So thank you, Asma.
Thank you. Thanks, Evan. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm delighted to welcome you to this session on award-winning journalists, and I will be presiding at this session. As you can see, we have 6 distinguished panelists who will be talking about their work and talking in general about the impact of religion in the public sphere. For the first hour of our session, I will be posing certain questions to the panelists and eliciting their responses. If it tends to go over a little bit, that's also fine. But I would like to reserve a pretty substantial chunk of time of the remaining session, about an hour or so, for you. We will open up the floor at that point and elicit your questions and comments. I know that Evan did quickly give us short bios on the panelists, but I would like to reintroduce them and just kind of focus on their professional positions and their contributions in no particular order. So maybe if you could raise your hand as I mention your name. Daniel Burke is CNN's religion editor, where he writes in-depth news and analysis pieces while editing the award-winning religion section known as CNN Beliefs, which has been named Best Online Religion Section by the Religion News Association every year since 2014. Next is Jack Jenkins. He is a national reporter for Religion News Service based in Washington, covering U.S. Catholics and the intersection of religion and politics. Kelsey Dallas is a national religion reporter at the Deseret News in Salt Lake City. She covers the intersection of faith and politics and has been tracking the Trump administration's religious freedom policies and high-profile Supreme Court cases. John Sawyer is executive director of the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting, a nonprofit organization that funds independent reporting with the intent of raising the standard of media coverage of global affairs, and that also supports a broad range of educational initiatives. Sawyer became the center's founding director after a 31-year career with the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. And I want to thank John for stepping up to the plate when Lucien Perkins, also from the Pulitzer Center, had to withdraw and is unable to attend the session. Our fifth panelist, unfortunately, is not here yet. His flight was canceled last night, but I hear that he has landed in Denver Airport and is on his way. And as soon as he gets here, we will seat him at the podium. And that's Jason Motlog, also at the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting. He is a writer, broadcast journalist, and filmmaker whose work focuses on conflict and human rights. He was formerly Time Magazine's Afghanistan correspondent and has reported from more than 50 countries and written for magazines and newspapers like the National Geographic, the Washington Post, the Guardian, and the Economist. So I'm going to go ahead and pose my first question to you, and you can respond in any manner and fashion, in any order. Among the stories you reported on recently, which of them would you say are among your favorites? What made them particularly enjoyable and interesting for you to write on them? How did you go about conducting your research for these stories? And what do you feel you've learned from these stories? So it's a cluster of questions, and you can address them, in any order. I hope that was not too overwhelming. I'm assuming there was a reason you wrote these stories, and do you have a soft spot for any particular one or two among them?
For me? Okay. First of all, thank you to AAR for the award. I dedicate it to every religion scholar who spent hours with me on the phone explaining some concept, only to see a quote about that big show up in the piece. I owe you all a drink, and I'll buy you one here if you want. But seriously, the work of religion scholars informs and improves every piece, almost every piece that I do. And the ones that are not improved are not because religion scholars are not doing great work, but it's just a tight deadline sometimes. Really, thank you to AAR, and congrats to Kelsey and Jack, whose work is excellent, must-read work. In terms of the stories that I submitted and looking through them compared to last year, we just don't have as much time to write these kind of pieces that I wrote at last year. The piece on Roy Moore, the Roy Moore election happened the same week that Trump moved the embassy to Jerusalem, and happened the same week that the Supreme Court was hearing a significant case on gay marriage. And so there was this confluence of religious events that would seem to be religious events that were deeply, deeply divisive. And I was curious about the extent to which it actually was religion driving those divisions. What happens a lot around the world, as we know, is that when you drill down deep on these stories, religion is often the pretext for certain actions, but it's not often the real driving force. There are other sort of issues at play. So with all of these three things, I wanted to look at, okay, is religion really at play? Just to speak about the Supreme Court case, I misspoke. It was Masterpiece Cake Shop. That was the case that was before the Supreme Court that week. And people were outside protesting, and there was one side arguing very strenuously one argument, and the other side arguing the exact opposite, and there was no common ground. And so that's sort of problematic. And in terms of how the Supreme Court actually dealt with the decision and the fallout from that, it's really difficult to see how any of these issues have a sort of political response in our current environment. So I think in terms of that story, we're just going to see more and more religious divisions and politicians exploiting those religious divisions to gain power. We've seen quite a bit of that. I don't think that's going to stop. I think that's going to be a big story in 2019 and 2020 as well.
I can jump in because part of what I wanted to say had to do with that Masterpiece Cake Shop case that Daniel just mentioned. A core part of the work that I do is related to religious freedom, related to how we each try to define it, how our policymakers try to enforce it, and then how courts step in to say whether certain actions are fair. And I was just talking yesterday, tweeting, because I was on Twitter talking about how it was the 25th birthday of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And I was saying, this piece of legislation has been so good to me professionally that I write about it regularly. And one of the responses I got was, hey, Kelsey, are you aware of the forces that were working against religious freedom in Masterpiece Cake Shop and other types of cases? The money that is being put out there to attack religious freedom. And I was trying to explain a little bit of it to my husband, and I was saying, you know, what's funny is that some of those supporters, some of that money, think that they're actually supporting religious freedom, that they're trying to keep us at a place where we're protecting the vulnerable, but we're not moving past it to sort of do specific protections for more conservative religious objectors to same-sex marriage. And so it's just a very fascinating moment right now in this public debate over what religious freedom even means. And you saw that in 2 of the 3 stories that I entered here, which one was about the Christian conservative legal movement, which includes the Alliance Defending Freedom, which was the law firm representing Jack Phillips, the baker and owner of Masterpiece Cake Shop, and then also the story of the hunt for religious freedom protection for Sikh soldiers, and how those are both involved in the same debate, but they sort of couldn't be more different in terms of how they play out and public perceptions of them.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and I want to pick up on, I think, a point that Dan made about the time it takes to do the kind of reporting that AAR is honoring in this great work that's represented on the stage here today, and what I hope is the role that the Pulitzer Center tries to play in facilitating that kind of work. And I just cite 2 or 3 quick examples and start with Lucian Perkins' work, since I'm really standing in for him, who, because of illness, could not be here today. And Lucian is a really extraordinary photographer who spent most of his career at the Washington Post and now freelancing. And he came to us with a project about a little town in the Haute-Loire in central France, Le Chambon-sur-Lignon. And it's a town of just a few thousand people that for centuries has been a haven for refugees, going back to the 16th century when Huguenots were protected there at a time of Catholic persecution. And more famous in the recent past was that in World War II, this town of about 2,700 people took in 3,500 Jews and sheltered them in their homes and helped them hide and survive the war. And the really extraordinary thing that they did. And today they continue on taking in refugees from Syria, from the Democratic Republic of Congo, from North Africa, way out of proportion to their numbers or the resources. So the story that Lucian did for Smithsonian was just giving a sense of how that happened and what drove the people in this town. And one of the things that he and his co-writer noted in the piece was that during World War II, there was not a single instance of anybody in the town betraying anyone else. And how they call that the miracle of silence, that with so many people being hidden, that the story, none of that information got to the Nazi occupiers. But you all know that, and Hannah Arendt has made famous the phrase, the banality of evil, the ease with which ordinary people come to do monstrous things. And historian Daniel Snyder and others have written searing books like Bloodlands about how that happens. Lucian's work was trying to capture something else, what a scholar studying Chambon-sur-Lignon is quoted in the story as calling the banality of goodness. And it's really important to remember that that's a part of our world and life as well, particularly in times as fractious as those we're living in today. So in terms of time to do stories and the the power of a story, the power of individual stories. We did one project over the last year with Time Magazine with Lindsay Addario, the photographer and writer and videographer, where they spent an entire year following 3 Syrian families who happened to, what they had in common was that each of these families had a new baby born as they were arriving in Greece a year and a half ago. And so Time did a cover story at the beginning of this year, and then another cover story at the end of the year, and then this wonderful interactive feature over the course of the year, and a lot of intermediary reporting along the way to tell all of the challenges that these families were facing as they tried to adapt to life in Europe. We did another project with Danny Gold, video documentary projects for Vice and PBS NewsHour, looking at the role that evangelical churches were playing in El Salvador with people in prison for membership in the gangs, of course, some of the most violent gangs in the world, and the lead role that the churches were taking in responding to that crisis. I'm hoping that Jason Motlog is going to walk in shortly so he can tell his own stories about Myanmar and the reporting that he did there. But those are examples of what we think is very important to do.
So I first want to also thank AAR for the honor and for this award. I've been coming to AAR infrequently since I was a grad student. I was usually the person in the back half paying attention who was on their phone. I can see, there you go. All right, good. The tradition continues. No judgment. So this is an honor to be alongside such esteemed journalists. But I will note for me, you were asking kind of like recent stories, which I'm assuming you're referring to this year. And there's an interesting comparison between, as Dan noted, last year and this year in terms of just how I spent my time. The stories I wrote for this that are being honored today were actually written when I worked at Think Progress, where I had a little more time to go in depth and like wax poetic about certain ideas. And this year it's harder to do that because there's still a lot happening, and journalists get stretched to have to cover every single thing that falls under the massive umbrella that is religion and politics, and the intersection of the two. And so, I will note what's interesting, though to me, is the development of those stories that I was working on last year. I thought I was particularly clever for talking about Christian nationalism last year. That was like a thing that no one else had heard about. 1, I was wrong. 2, many scholars informed me of how wrong I was during the course of that series. And 3, now you can see it is part of the parlance, part of the discourse, is people noting that phenomenon and how it underlies and undergirds our American political moment. And conversely, when I was, covering the Charlottesville stuff and the role of those faith leaders in those protests, one thing I kind of got used to was when I would cover, progressive faith communities and their activism, is I was often usually the only one there who was a journalist. There might be 1 or 2, but often I was there alone. And this year that is not the case. I go to these events and now I'm like a third string reporter behind all these other people who are noting their events and noting their influence. So it's been really interesting just to watch how we have national conversations about religion and politics flex and ebb and flow just over the course of the last 2 years.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Let's go on to the next question. So I'm assuming that some of you have had a chance to follow up on some of these stories. So do you have updates to share with us about the stories themselves, or about some of the characters and events that you describe in them?
Sure. So one of the stories that I submitted was about the questions about the Dead Sea Scrolls in the collection of the Bible Museum. And it was sort of buried until they held a press conference like a week before. And they had this panel, and everyone was talking about how great the Bible Museum is. And then this professor just let slip, oh yeah, we haven't dealt with the Dead Sea Scroll thing. And I was like, what? Excuse me? So people had written about it, I think, a little bit already in the academic community, but it was really interesting to see that he sort of tried to walk it back, but then continued to report it, and actually they did send them away for testing and came back a couple weeks ago that at least 5 are fake, and that probably more. I think that story has legs, as editors say. Someone is doing that, and someone's making a lot of money. It's going to be a really interesting story to see who's doing it. I kind of think of it as like a David Grand meets Elaine Pagels type story. I really hope I'm the one who gets to tell it, but I'm not sure. I know a lot of people are probably anxious to tell that story, but I'm absolutely fascinated. I went deep down the rabbit hole on the Dead Sea Scrolls, and what could be more interesting than crime and religion and history and the Bible Museum and evangelicals? It's awesome. It's all my buttons, so.
I'll touch again on that story about the Christian conservative legal movement. And I got credit for being timely because we were watching as the Masterpiece Cake Shop case unfolded, but the credit actually goes to a religion scholar, Daniel Bennett, who wrote an incredibly timed book. I just find that an amazing example of how someone's research met the current political and legal movement in just an amazing way. So I loved writing about his work, and it's been so helpful for me moving forward because after Masterpiece Cake Shop, we move into this fall and sort of pay attention to which cases might appear, might have big implications for the religious freedom space or just faith communities in general. And Alliance Defending Freedom is involved in one of the cases that has to do with the scope of sex discrimination, so things like Title IX and Title VII. The Supreme Court hasn't yet decided whether they'll weigh in on that particular case, but they're going to be conferencing about 3 different ones and think about sex discrimination. And then there's also an issue with this huge cross that's in Bladensburg, Maryland, and that a organization called First Liberty, which is another one of these conservative Christian legal movement organizations, is involved in that. They're working on behalf of the American Legion. So it was so smart of Daniel to focus in on this topic and then to let me sort of share that work with maybe an even wider audience.
As far as following up on Christian nationalism, I feel like I probably do that once a week. But I mean, it's just part of the discourse. And I will say that it's been interesting to watch. I mean, some of the scholars that were just doing preliminary research then in sociology of religion space about understanding what Christian nationalism actually is. They're now writing a book about it. I do know there's at least one paper here at AAR that's being given on the topic that it argues that Christian nationalism lays the groundwork for white nationalism. So I want to go learn about that. But I mean, a part of that too, when I wrote the first part of that series, I made an offhand reference to this, upstart Senate candidate Roy Moore, who was still thought to be a long shot in the state of Alabama, and then by the end of the series, he had ascended and was about to be elected the senator from Alabama. So that story has persisted and continued as well. And so I do continue to follow up on that topic, and I continue to be interested in it. But quite frankly, there's a lot of my colleagues who are doing infinitely more interesting work on it because they're able to drill down on some of the specific players in that space. Meanwhile, talking about the Charlottesville protests, when I was kind of doing a reconstruct of what happened with the activists who were there on the front lines in Charlottesville, the ones who stared down white supremacists, I got to know some of these different progressive faith activists. And it's been interesting, since then they have continued to crop up in other events and other protests. Those folks will, Reverend Tracy Blackman, for instance, she was, there in Charlottesville. She was also, part of the ACA protests. She was part of various protests this year. She was, in Georgia ahead of the midterms, helping, speak at an event the day before the election there. And again, so these if it's a story, their characters have started to crop up more. And so I haven't followed up specifically on if they plan on returning to Charlottesville, but they bring up Charlottesville and their time there quite frequently in their political activism. And so I've been able to kind of note that and acknowledge that lineage since then. So, I mean, I think there's a myriad of different things to track in that space. And I will note that the activists who were based in Charlottesville, the faith-based activists, continue to organize and continue to actually help train people in other parts of the country for those kinds of potential conflicts with white supremacists. But that seems to be an ongoing story.
And I just want to add that Jack has been an important force on the Faith Beat, pushing all of us to pay more attention to the religious left, whether it exists. Can we point to it in research? At our annual conference, Religion News Association went to the mic and said, "Hey, you from Pew Research Center, do more on this topic." So it's really cool how some of these big projects change the type of topics the rest of us are paying attention to.
It was clearly a selfish interest of mine. Please do research on this thing so I can write about it. But also, thank you. That means a lot coming from you.
So this is a question that came up in the panel that just preceded us, but I think it's a question that I do need to pose to all of you as well. President Trump has made very little effort to hide his disdain for journalists and have often accused media outlets of deliberately targeting him and circulating what he calls fake news about him. And as we all know, he has gone as far as to say that the press and the media are the enemy of the people. Have these hostile characterizations affected your work in any way and impacted the way you select topics and choose to report on them? And I think a parallel or a corollary question would be that I'm sure you also get very strong reactions from your readers when you report on something that's controversial. So with this backdrop in mind, how has that taken a toll on your work, or not? And how has that influenced your ability to pick certain topics or talk about them at great length in your work?
Okay, well, at CNN, we have an awesome relationship with President Trump, so I think we're all good. You know, I try not to pay too much attention to it, to be honest. When we started getting the hoax bombs in the mail, it was scary for me because I get a lot of unsolicited religious manuscripts in the mail that look an awful lot like those packages. And from time to time, I would open them just to see, you know, what was in them, read them maybe. And we don't get those anymore. Those are off-site. They're screened. It will be an open question what we do with mail like that. So personally, that was a tough week, seeing my colleagues in New York evacuated. You know, we don't know everything about why this person did what he did, but obviously that was a direct effect on what we did and how we did it. In terms of the story selection, it really doesn't affect me at all. It's just sort of, it affects my sources at times. There are conservative Christians who used to be very good sources of mine who no longer are. Because of CNN's battle with the president. I have to admit that. They don't want to be seen quoted by the president's least favorite news organization. They don't want us in their church. Sometimes the worry is that puts you or pushes you to just quote the fringy voices who will talk to you, particularly on television, and I constantly sort of fight against that. But it definitely has affected how particular types of viewers view CNN and my work and what I want to do in a real way.
Yeah, just a couple of points from the perspective of the Pulitzer Center. I think that one effect of what the president has done is just to suck a lot of the oxygen out of not just religion coverage, but almost any coverage that is not Trump-centric. And that's we see that in terms of the projects that we support across the board, where it's more difficult to get airtime or to get space in newspapers and outlets because everything is driven. And I personally, as somebody who's been in this business for 40 plus years, I think that the media has really played into the manipulative tendencies of this president. He is he's not the master of many things, but he is a master at dominating the news cycle. And he can turn over in bed at 4 in the morning and put out 130 or 170 characters, and that drives the narrative all day long. And then we jump to the next story, and we jump to the next story, and a lot of it is outrageous and outlandish and false, but it has the effect of undermining credibility in any kind of media. And then we see it because in another way that we do a lot of projects with outlets like NPR and PBS NewsHour, the New York Times, the New Yorker, and most of them, one time or another, end up getting lumped into the so-called fake news category. And he has had an impact in changing attitudes toward those large, important, and for the most part, highly credible outlets. So the other part of what the Pulitzer Center does is a lot of educational outreach. We have a network of universities, and we do a lot of work in secondary schools and middle schools around the country. And I'm conscious of the fact that 5, 10 years ago, if we did a project for NPR or the New York Times, it had a credibility in our taking it out to classrooms that it doesn't have the same today, because there is this kind of creeping loss of credibility. So we find ourselves looking to do more work with media outlets, local media outlets, regional outlets, and particularly red state areas of the country, because we're looking for ways in to have a conversation to bridge the gaps that these more yawning every day. I'm also actively trying to find projects, good journalism projects that we could do in partnership with Fox News, but that would be good journalism projects just for the sake of trying to reach those audiences. And that's all in response to the really quite fundamental changes that he's affected in the attitudes toward to the media.
I will note that in my old job at Think Progress, I got a lot more hate mail than I do now, precisely because of what it represented, right? It had the word progress in the name, and so people would hate read things and then send you mean emails. And that's, particularly if I wrote about Islam, that's the only time I got death threats, was during that era, when anti-Muslim sentiment was at a height, which it remains as such. But they would often, say that, hey, you reported on this thing factually, but I don't like that it's factual. Like, essentially, the fact that you accurately reported on something showed bias, and that's a difficult thing to argue with, because as a reporter, you do feel obligated to make sure that you represent those involved in a story. It's not fair to obscure voices, to obscure arguments, but it's also not fair to simply gloss over the truth. And I think has been a particular challenge for myself and a lot of my fellow journalism. People in this space, is because at the end of the day, to be viewed as biased is to simply disagree with the president, and that's something that a precedent that whether or not he did it intentionally, the president has set. And so I think we've often found ourselves in a bind. I mean, I was in Maine recently, and when we spoke with a random person in Maine, and they found out that myself and the person I was with were journalists, his response was, "Well, I'm a Republican," and I'm like, but I didn't say but it doesn't matter. That's the view, is that the idea that this press can be enemy of the people. But I think it is important that journalists, despite how frustrating that can be, and despite how annoying that can be, you have to push past it, because my job isn't to stand there and argue with that person in Maine about whether or not the press represents the opposition party. My job is to ask that person about the story and to try to accurately and fairly represent their perspective, regardless of whether or not I agree with it. And I think it's really kind of putting, from my perspective, journalists in a pressure cooker that way, where you have to write your stories with duress. And I envy Dan's ability to just switch it off. I think he's a leader in that space of deleting Twitter from his phone, and helping us all forge a more mentally stable and emotionally stable space in journalism. But I do think it's a constant challenge for a lot of us.
I'll start with just picking up on that emotional stability piece, just to say, in a practical sense, some of the president's language and then responses to it have meant stronger security measures at my place of work. I tweeted about it the first day I walked in, and it was like, every single person who enters this building needs to show their badge, and it just wasn't a great feeling. I'm sort of an anxious person to begin with, and so it's not fun to start my day feeling like there is this bigger threat than there was a year ago. But I will note, sort of professionally, rising tensions between the press and the president have sort of made me be very careful when I approach stories that are about certain Trump administration policies, just taking a little extra care to make sure I'm being fair, because, I mean, clearly there's a lot of frustration in newsrooms about the language they use, and so you might let yourself get away with not characterizing something or not representing the views of the people who support the Trump administration. So I've just tried to be very careful still that I'm still producing unbiased coverage, that someone who voted for Trump and someone who didn't vote for Trump can still learn from the article and feel interested in the topic.
So when you write your stories on religion, you frequently consult with scholars of religion. And I'm rather curious about how you go about finding these scholars. What kind of expertise and background are you looking for in these people? Have these experiences in general been productive and faithful? In the preceding panel, we sort of got a sense of how those journalists worked with scholars that they had a relationship with. And then do you find yourself going back to many of the same scholars once you establish that kind of a relationship? And perhaps because we are here at AAR, has AAR proved itself to be a useful source for finding these kinds of scholars? Again, we can start anywhere we want.
Okay. Well, I would just want to echo what Lori said about Religion Source, AAR's erstwhile website that connected journalists with scholars. It was amazing, not only because it gave you the contact information of the actual people working on it, but their publications, so that I could actually read them and be informed when I talked to them ahead of time. So I didn't have to do catch-up or homework later. I could sort of be prepared. I think we find scholars everywhere these days. We find them on Twitter, on Facebook, on other places on the web, in my inbox quite a bit, newsletters, everywhere. We're awash in opinions, many of them scholarly. And so finding particular people, I tend not to try to go back to the same people all the time. I think I'm really sort of conscious of trying to include other voices as much as possible. Sort of always looking in the story of who is not being represented, who is not being heard. And that's not only scholars, but obviously all kinds of sources. But I think pretty much everywhere is where you find scholars these days, and that's a great thing. Like having religion scholars on Twitter has been awesome. I know Twitter can be a difficult space for people, but when it's good, it's really good. And people like Kevin Cruz and other people do it really, really well. And it's enjoyable to read, to be honest. And I wish there were more of it.
I've been lucky in finding sources to draw on the network of friends and colleagues that I built by doing a grad program in religion at Yale Divinity School. Before I knew I was going to write about religion, I just wanted to study religion. It was one of my majors in undergrad, and then I got the Master of Arts in Religion. So it's been wonderful to continue to turn to friends who are in PhD programs now and ask them for advice on who to interview. But I want to give a huge shout out as well to social media. I love following different people that I maybe have already interviewed, and they're having conversations with new folks that sort of jump out at me. Just a really fun story from recently was that I was not necessarily in the market for a Halloween story. As religion reporters, we typically focus on Christmas or Easter, but Union Theological Seminary started doing a fun practice on Fridays where they have one of their scholars tweet about the research they're doing, and in mid-October they happened to feature a professor who is studying monster theory, and it just jumped out at me because I had no clue that you could specialize in such a thing. So it turned into a great little Halloween feature on biblical monsters.
I will jump in to say that I have also benefited from a network of friends that I made at the rival divinity school institution to yours. But the truth is there's diminishing returns. At some point, like, it's just not easy to find a scholar in all the different permutations of faith. And there's often a lot of Googling and social media and things like that I'll have to rely on. I will note this, though. I do think this has changed a good bit in the last 10, 15 years, but I do recall that there's some reticence among scholars to want to just throw ideas out into social media or into popular publications, the idea being that that's not really scholarship. And I totally understand within the academy that is like something that you want to be careful about what you present, you want to be intentional about your work. But also, if you don't, then the people who are out in front are the ones who get the phone calls from journalists. And so I would encourage journalists to make your voice known, to not be afraid to just tag some research that you've done recently in a thread next to a journalist, just to kind of let them know. I mean, the worst that could happen is, well, I'm not really interested in that kind of stuff, but I had no idea that there was somebody who knew a whole lot about Zoroastrianism, like at the University of Montana. Like, these are things that I could learn only through Google or if I have a personal interaction. So if there's any way, anything I could offer to the academy at this point, it's like, don't be afraid to contact a journalist directly or to speak up when you hear that a story, like if there's a bunch of attention around a certain faith group that you know or faith issue that you know quite a bit about, and there's probably only like 3 or 4 other people that are competent enough to speak about it. Because oftentimes what becomes difficult in our profession is finding that scholar can be hard, and we'll defer to the one that we do find. And I've written stories where, a week later they're like, that is the wrong person for you to have quoted on that issue. And I'll be like, that's great. Who should I be quoting? And that's how I can learn into the next story. But please don't be afraid to reach out to us.
So in our work for the Pulitzer Center, associations with people at AAR, with religious studies, academics in general, with universities, is hugely important. Obviously we play a different role here. We're more facilitators of this kind of work than actual direct producers of it. So we raise money, then we give grants to journalists to go out and do work on a wide range of things. And of course they all are getting access to expertise and through social media, through all the things that you've just heard from my fellow panelists here. The extra role that I think that we try to play is that by association by coming the last several years to AAR and the things that I've learned here by the work that we've done with academic partners, it raises the level, we hope, of our own sophistication in how we vet proposals, and hopefully increases the quality of and the penetration of the kinds of questions that we're addressing in the journalism that we do. I mentioned earlier that we also have this network of universities and colleges around the country, and this last year, partly out of the work that we've done on religion in the last 4 or 5 years, Georgetown came in as one of our campus consortium member schools, and the Pulitzer Center, led by Sean Casey, and there the focus is on our religion reporting. So there are fellowships for students to go out and do reporting fellowships with us, but we also do symposia on campus in concert with Sean and his colleagues, and drawing from the reporting that we do. And we do similar things with schools of public health, with schools of journalism, with environmental studies at Yale, and so on. And in each of those instances, it's been so invigorating and educational for us as an organization, just to be to be able to kind of sit in rooms like this and talk with experts like you, to confront questions that we hadn't even considered, and hopefully do better journalism as a result.
I think many of us would agree that since the 2016 presidential elections, religion has left its stamp on the presidency and the American public sphere more so than ever before. and many would say not necessarily in positive ways. And we are, of course, reminded of several incidents in the last couple of years: the Muslim travel ban in its various incarnations, the move of the US Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, the recent ministerial on religious freedom, sponsored by the State Department under Mike Pompeo, and of course another very important issue is immigration. And the way former Attorney General Jeff Sessions quoted from the Bible, specifically Romans 13, to justify the separation of families. And maybe a number of us in our classes had the occasion to discuss that, how scripture can be deployed to support certain social, political agendas. So I would be very interested in learning your impressions of the way religion casts a very long shadow over the current administration, and what may be described as the instrumentalization of religion to grant legitimacy to a number of controversial and unpopular measures. And actually, Jack, I think in your pieces on Christian nationalism, I think you do start to address some of those issues. So why don't we start with you, and because you've obviously given this quite a bit of thought, and
Yes,
I would like to know how you continue to think about this.
If anything, I will work really hard to keep myself. I could talk for hours on this.
We have a little time.
Well, I mean, it's one of those things where it's unfair to label the Trump administration as uniquely, using religion in a political context. That is an old American tradition that dates back some time. But and it's one of those things where it's almost like the volume of ways that the Trump administration has used it is what differentiates his administration from previous ones. Like, it's actually, the concept of banning a faith from entering the country actually dates back to when there was an effort to do so to Mormons. And so that was why you saw a lot of pushback from members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints when Trump proposed, and it was initially an explicitly Muslim ban when he proposed it during the campaign. And so that was like a weird historical fluke back in the day, but that was just step one for what this administration ended up doing in terms of talking about faith in a way that felt to many people at using it as a cudgel or as just a tool. And I think part of it too is underlying that critique is the feeling that the relationship between particularly white American evangelicals and the Trump administration is, many people see it as transactional, which is not necessarily the same thing as it was under, say, George W. Bush, where they felt that there was this claim that he was one of their own, and there was this relationship theologically between those different groups. Whereas with Trump, usually when many white evangelical leaders are called on to television shows to talk about this, they're basically asked the same question over and over, which is, so how? Like, how do you support this guy given how he operates or the things that he says? And that critique of white evangelicals and their relationship with the Trump fair or not undergirds how the rest of the rest of the Trump administration's use of faith gets actualized. So, I mean, you even got to the point where, I don't know if y'all saw on the recent Saturday Night Live episode when Jeff Sessions was, they sang him off, gave him a goodbye, as they frequently do when Trump administration officials leave. He actually held up a Bible, the caricature of Jeff Sessions, and said, this book, I use this to justify a lot of bad things, and then put it into his little, box to walk away. And the fact that they even made that joke in the public sphere is really interesting to me, because you had that. Saturday Night Live bothered to pay attention to it and bothered to lift up that critique as a part of our comedic discourse. And that's relatively new. Then conversely, you have a resurgent religious left whose power in the public sphere is in many ways a response to that, right? So part of the reason that they get as much oxygen as they do at this point is because Americans are lifting up a different faith voice because of the critiques that have been lobbed against white evangelicals, as well as other conservative Christians and conservative religious individuals who, whether it's the moving of the embassy in Israel, whether it's the immigration debate, which is important to remember that those who have been calling for changes in our immigration system and who have been working along the border and who have been critical of border policies have been doing it since long before Trump. And they are faith-based activists who were they were also deeply critical of the Obama administration, and now just have a lot more volunteers under the Trump administration. And so for me, it's been really interesting because, to your original question, suddenly the way we are having a national conversation about the way faith is used to justify policy in a way that I felt was less of a national discourse and more of a sub-discourse in years past. It felt like something that was really interesting to people in this room, but less so for Saturday Night Live. And so with that power comes great responsibility on the part of religion journalists, because you want to make sure that you interpret that correctly and treat it fairly. But I do think we're having a particular moment now where the divisions in the American religious landscape and how they play into public policies is becoming just an everyday dinner table conversation.
I'll just add that one of the earlier pieces that I was most proud of in my career was sort of a reflection on President Obama, like a religious freedom report card. What are the key policies he put forth that stood out to faith communities for good or ill? And it sort of hit maybe 6 notes over the course of his 8 years in office. I could have done more, but these were sort of the key moments that we needed to talk about. And it strikes me that in the Trump administration, I could write one of those of similar length every quarter. Let's do a review, because there is, as Jack said, so much happening, so much that does deserve coverage. Although I'll note that before the panel, Daniel just briefly mentioned that he maybe doesn't want to cover the Trump administration as much, and that's a good reminder, because there's important faith stories out there that really do have nothing to do with the White House, and I was reminded in that fun Halloween story that readers do really like them, so maybe mix it up a little bit more.
Totally agree, yeah. I'm a little bit Trumped out, but here's what I'll say about Trump, though. He doesn't seem to be a conventionally religious person, right? There's sort of no there, but and I haven't fully fleshed out this idea, so I'm just sort of testing it out, but he seems to be brilliant at a certain kind of civil religion. Call it NASCAR civil religion. The anthem issue is a civil religious issue. It has to do with the flag, the country, veterans, patriotism, or at least he's made it that way. A lot of religion journalists laughed when he said, we're going to bring back Merry Christmas. There just wasn't a concern on anybody's religious freedom radar at all. And yet when you talk to a certain type of white evangelical, that actually does matter to them. They think that they've won that war. And some of that is Trump being a good salesman, right? But also he's reframing the debate about what civil religion is. He's using it also in a very different way. He's using it in a divisive way, whereas in the conventional notion, the Robert Bellah notion, it's something that sort of binds America together. Obama was more focused on that, using civil religion to sort of bring Americans together. Trump is sort of the opposite. So I think there's something to do there with a non-conventionally religious president still using a sort of civil religious template to reach out to just one group, white evangelicals. Like, he doesn't seem to be concerned about really any other religious group. Under Obama, under everyone else, Catholic bishops would be in the White House, once a year at least. But now, if you look at pictures that often evangelicals are tweeting about meetings with the White House, it's all evangelicals in that picture. And so when you talk about Trump and religion, you're really talking about Trump and white evangelicals.
So I'm delighted to announce that Jason Motlagh is now here on our panel. You rushed from the airport to join us, and for that I'm very grateful on behalf of everyone present here. So the next question has to do with your current projects, and I think, Jason, I would like you to go first. So could you let us know about some of the projects you're currently working on and how they're related to the, some of the burning questions and issues of our time? And I know that you're working on the Rohingya Muslims in particular in Myanmar, so we'd love to hear about that.
Yeah, thanks. Sorry I'm late. I finally got on a flight this morning, so I've been up since 3 a.m., so I'll try and be coherent for you all. I'm assuming there's a little background on the Rohingya reporting we've done. Yeah, and so I've been tracking the Rohingya story since it sort of first popped up on the radar, 2013, thereabouts, and you were just beginning to see some of these latent nationalist currents being unleashed in the country. But, you know, I, like so many other journalists, were sort of sidetracked by, you know, this amazing democratic thaw, this opening up of this country that had been hermetically sealed for so many decades. And I was a little slow in sort of getting hip to a lot of these troubles that were festering at the fringes of the country. In fact, the first minority conflict that I covered was in the north of the country in Kachin, which is a Christian territory. And they've been fighting this long-running war with the government. And that was sort of a warning sign, because that reignited in tandem with this liberalization in the country, which was kind of counterintuitive. You know, this idea that we're going to start to reach out to these ethnic minorities and bring them into the fold and extend the writ of the government. And meanwhile, the military, you know, which has been operating in these shadowlands for so long, basically using it as their own piggy bank and killing people with impunity who stand in the way of their resources, was ramping up this campaign there. So that was very much a warning. That's something that is intensifying again now as we speak, kind of behind the smokescreen of a lot of the troubles that we've seen in Rakhine State and the atrocities perpetrated against the Rohingya. So it's not just the Rohingya, but that was kind of my awakening, and initially made some trips out to the camps in Rakhine, and you know, there's a lot of euphemisms that are used, but these are very much concentration camps. These are people who have been systematically dehumanized, portrayed as animals, an existential threat to the Buddhist majority, and like animals, they've been confined in pens, in open-air prisons. And people were dying of preventable diseases, and it was still a story that was kind of being given short shrift. And anyone who was there 4 or 5 years ago, you knew it was just a matter of time before these feelings hardened into something more like radicalism. And so when these Rohingya militants came on the scene, these are basically farmers with sticks, but you know, carrying out suicide missions, it was very much an act of desperation. But you know, it dovetailed with nationalist currents that were intensifying, and it gave the authorities, the religious authorities as well, who still carry a lot of clout in the country, pretext and a distraction. And gradually things have escalated, and you know, there were even warning signs in Rakhine State before the violence of last August, which was the worst episode we've seen to date. More than 700,000 people killed, displaced, unknown thousands killed. To this day, investigators, independent journalists have not been able to enter that part of the country to do an autopsy of what happened. But you know, as far back as October of 2016, the military was mobilizing forces. They were depriving the people of food and aid. They were raising death squads and militias. So there were these precursors to the wholesale violence that we saw last year. So the writing was very much on the wall. And you know, unfortunately, never again became once again. And it's very unlikely that the people responsible for these crimes are going to be held to account. So what we've been trying to track this evolution, degeneration, whatever you want to call it, over the years, with support from the Pulitzer Center most recently, and they helped us partner with the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. So now we're in the process of distilling some of our film work and reporting into what's going to become a semi-permanent, hopefully permanent exhibition at the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. So at least there will be some meaningful, comprehensive record. It's myself, many other people who have been committed to this story for a long time will be contributing to that. It's fallen out of the news. You know, unfortunately, it took a catastrophic event, a genocide, to pop up on our news radar, and it's gone. As we speak, you're seeing the wheels turning again. They're trying to forcibly repatriate a lot of these people who have been displaced to Bangladesh. And this is before anyone has been held accountable. So it really just speaks to the total failure to address this in earnest and punish what happened. And I think that just, I don't know if it sets a precedent, but it fuels this kind of impunity. And I think, we're likely to see more of these sorts of acts, campaigns around the world, in this current climate. But, people are still committed to the story. We often need support from outlets like the Pulitzer Center to go and cover these stories because they're not, news outlets aren't lining up to support it. But that's going to be something that we follow for the foreseeable future, and we're still hoping to potentially roll all of this work into a more comprehensive documentary film that really connects the dots on how we got here, how the UN and Western countries failed to heed the warning signs, got caught up in all sorts of political shenanigans, and ultimately saw people slaughtered wholesale on their watch.
Asma, can I just add one more thing about while we're on Myanmar and coverage and Jason, it's been wonderful for us to be able to work with Jason for the last 6 or 7 years on this and other topics, and he has an extraordinary talent for being able to find multiple outlets for his work, and this on Myanmar, it's been everywhere from documentaries for Al Jazeera to Rolling Stone, the Washington Post, and more, in addition to the Holocaust Memorial Museum work that he's working on now. But in terms of our own approach to that topic, and this, I think, speaks to where we are in with journalism, the state of journalism today, that for all of the stresses that we're under, there is much more openness to collaborations and sort of coming at stories and working together than in the past. And so we've been able to do partnerships. And on this topic, other people were coming to us with proposals. And so, we did a project with Doug Bach-Clark on social media and the use of social media by extremist Buddhist monks in Myanmar for Wired magazine. And we did an amazing project with a team of AP, Associated Press writers and reporters on rape as a weapon of war in Myanmar. And then we did a cover story for Politico with Hallie Tusi, one of the more really challenging pieces that we've been involved with, which was looking at not current policy, but the Obama administration's policy and the failure over the 2013, 2016, 17 period of the Obama national security staff and top leaders in that government to realize and confront what was happening, because they were so caught up in the drama of Myanmar coming in from the cold and being reaccepted in the community of nations, that steps that we might have taken we didn't take. And then we were able to take all of those projects together and use them in our education lesson plans and take them out, set up fora on them at universities and our secondary schools to kind of broaden the discussion.
Jack, did you want to talk about some of your projects?
I'm sorry, what?
Oh, I thought we could just go down the panel and talk about some of the current projects that you're working on.
That I'm working on right now?
Yeah.
Oh, so, well, I can't tell you all of them.
No. Pick your favorite.
The best stories you won't hear about till they come out. No, I think one thing that I think many people in this room are already actively working on is the resurgent abuse crisis within the Catholic Church. Or at least the resurgence of discourse around the Catholic child sex abuse crisis and sex abuse crisis in general. And I think that one is going to be, I think it's been really interesting to see the various ways to look at and cover that story this go round, because there's the papal intrigue level, right, where there is this discourse between the papal nuncio, the ambassador from the Vatican here, the former one, and calling out Pope Francis and former Pope Benedict, and then that all infighting within Catholicism. And then there's this whole nother sector that helps underlie that conversation, which is this sectarian fight within Catholicism between conservative groups and more liberal groups within the church, trying to have proxy wars in the midst of the abuse crisis. And then there's the tangible on-the-ground impact of the crisis, both, first and foremost, the victims, and then also the everyday Catholics and how they are responding to this news and responding to the discourse around the church. I mean, several people in this room were with me at the U.S. Bishops' Conference last week and got to watch bishops get visibly uncomfortable with the fact that they weren't able to vote on resolutions that would help rein in the power of bishops if they mishandle cases of abuse or abuse people themselves. And as a reporter, that stretches you in multiple different directions because at some level, there's just a straight law enforcement story here where news about the federal investigation into Catholic dioceses in Pennsylvania and New York primarily came not from religion reporters, but from people who work with the Department of Justice, reporters who cover that. And you start to see all the different dimensions that can be looked at where, suddenly when these investigations at the state level started breaking, I suddenly became familiar with the communications directors for attorneys general all across the country, who I can assure you that a few of them, I was the first religion reporter that had ever called them. And I think for me, I'm keeping on that story and I'm continuing to track that story. So are a lot of other people. But I found a few ways, but I'm actively looking for other ways to uncover what's really going on with that story. Because obviously, in many ways, the abuse crisis was initiated by, the discourse around the abuse crisis was initiated by a piece of journalism, the Boston Globe's Spotlight report. But I think now another major player are the voices of law enforcement. And so it'll be a lot to keep track of here moving forward. But I think that's where I'm spending a lot of my time in terms of a project moving forward.
I continue to do quite a bit of work on religious freedom, both in terms of legislation and lawsuits. In June, I released a large analysis of state-level bills that were touching on faith communities and religious protections, and I sort of continue to reference that all the time in my work because it just helped me think about this moment in American life and which trends to watch moving forward. I'm sort of putting a cherry on top of that project next month with some reflections from smart people that I'm pulling together, sort of like a group op-ed of sort of where we go from here as a country. And then just as we look ahead to the 2020 presidential election, I've been doing some thinking more broadly about religion and politics. I was really taken by Michelle Margolis's work on political interests informing your religious beliefs, and so I did a project a couple weeks ago that was sort of talking with people like David Campbell who have been studying that area about sort of the deep relationship between politics and religion that we can never quite wrap our heads around. So that's just something I care about a lot, and I'm looking forward actually as the election ramps up, the debates about 2020, to just continue to have a reason to write about politics in general.
So just echoing what Jack said, absolutely, the Catholic sex abuse story is enormous. The international component, the American bishops component, the legal component, getting documentation, getting to the bottom of these stories is a full-time job. These are really, really complicated, complex stories with a lot of moving parts. It seems like every time I feel like I'm ahead of it, something happens and I'm 2 steps behind again, to be honest. It just pops up in unexpected places so often. I feel like since this summer I've sort of been like a crime reporter. My first piece this year was on Star Wars, and now I'm writing stories about just the worst human behavior. It's jarring and it's difficult. But it's important. I mean, when you talk to victims and you see the importance of telling their stories and getting to the bottom of them, it really stays with you. So that no matter how difficult it can get, it really makes an impression that you got to see it to the end. You got to see this story all the way through. just to sort of back up, and we talked about Twitter on a happier note. We talked about Twitter and how it can be useful, how it can't. I actually got a pretty big story out of Twitter recently, and I haven't told the story much, but so Hillary Clinton's Methodist pastor wrote a book of devotionals that he supposedly sent her during the presidential campaign. And he acknowledged that there were some other authors who helped him, a team of women scholars, but he claimed to be the main author. And I talked to him, and I think I wrote a Q&A about that, and I tweeted it out, and someone mentioned me. A pastor from Iowa wrote back and said, "Hey, I read that book. That's my sermon." And it was only because I had looked in my mentions, which sometimes it's painful to do that. But I looked through and I read them, contacted this pastor. He showed me exactly when he had written it. It was a timestamp blog post. Went back to the Hillary's pastor, and he admitted, yeah, he slipped up in that case. He slipped up, it turns out, in a lot more cases, and the book had to be pulled out, and it was sort of an embarrassment for Hillary and certainly for the pastor. But that story all came about because of Twitter, because I was reading my mentions that day, or at least it came out in the way that it came out, because of Twitter. So, pay attention to social media. There's things happening there. There's sources there. It's a good way to get in touch with journalists. I read a lot of the mentions. So just a kind of plug for that kind of experience on Twitter where you can get good stories there.
And I'll just note that Dan's Star Wars article is excellent. I say that as a Star Wars fan. So.
All right, thank you. So now we have about 45 minutes or so for questions from the floor. We do have 2 microphones in each of the aisles. Please do keep your comments and questions short. And if you are addressing your question or comment to a particular panelist, do mention that, or mention if you're addressing the panel as a whole. Please go ahead.
Hi, I'm Claudia Winkler from the Berkeley Center at Georgetown University. Thanks for the previous shout out, John. I just want to go back to this whole Trump posturing vis-a-vis the media briefly. I agree that his hostile stance to the press is alarming. But I think given our current media landscape, there is some legitimate room for criticism. I think being first before being accurate is a problem. I think there's absolutely biased media. You read the same story from 2 outlets and you wouldn't know that they're covering the same thing. And I also think there's a lot of context, important context that's missing from stories. So I think back to the so-called Muslim ban and the fact that in a lot of initial stories, it wasn't mentioned that these 7 countries that were on the list originated under the Obama administration as national security threats, right? That's important context, I think, for people to understand the issue fully and to make an informed decision about how they should feel. So I'm wondering if in your newsrooms, this current climate has prompted some what I consider much needed self-reflection on the media and on journalism as a profession. Thank you.
And this is for the panel as a whole.
We've had quite a few conversations at the Deseret News about what the future of journalism, at least for us, looks like. And I've been pleasantly surprised that we've been leaning more into long-term projects, investigations, context. We just find that if you're able to hit on the right type of topic and maybe even just the right headline, you're grabbing readers' attention in a much more meaningful way than you do with these quick hits. And so as we just recently had a staff meeting this week and we're going over big moments for us over the last year, it was really the work of the In-Depth team, which I'm on, that was being talked about as sort of helping us get to new people, jumping up in our readership and things like that. Not to say that the work of our local reporters is not incredibly important and sets the stage for what my team is up to. It's just that I've been really excited, as I said, someone who came to my type of work from a more academic approach, that it seems like we have more and more appreciation and can take a deep breath. You may want to have an initial version of a story out, but there is certainly an expectation that you'll add to it throughout the day. So I'm enjoying watching what my colleagues are up to, and I'm very thankful for the support in my own newsroom for longer projects.
So, thank you for your question. I think one of the things that it's important to sort of distinguish is difference between bias and just different people reporting in different ways because they're different people. I do think that with regards to Trump, there can be a tendency to overcorrect him, to correct every tweet, to start every show with a rundown of everything he's done wrong that day. I think it's tiring. I think it's boring. I think it's bad journalism. I can tell you that we have town halls at CNN where Jeff Zucker participates and answers questions from us. And at every one of those, there are questions about how we are covering Trump. There is a lot of reflection about that. He's candid with us about it, why he makes decisions, which we appreciate, but I think there is a feeling among people that sometimes some stories, some personalities go too far. Beyond the point of not agreeing or agreeing with them or being perceived as biased, for me, it's just like, my sources are watching you. Please don't say that. So it's kind of selfish in that way. But yes, there needs to be more reflection on the media's role in sort of amplifying and also being used by Trump. I mean, I don't want to talk out of turn, but it's clear that certain recent situations sort of redounded to his benefit in a way that I think we weren't overly cautious about. I don't think it benefits us to get in a war with the president. And I honestly don't think that's what we're trying to do. I just think that sometimes maybe emotions or whatever get too high. But there's a lot of room for, and especially as we gear up to 2020, right? But if you watch CNN a lot, you notice things have changed. Like, we don't run a lot of his rallies anymore. We didn't run a lot of the midterm rallies. We ran one, I think, after he made his comments in the media, and there was a particular situation that we wanted to take a look at, but our coverage has already changed, and I can see it changing more.
I'm glad you asked this question for a variety of reasons. So I do think it's been an interesting moment for journalists to express solidarity with fellow journalists, because the kinds of attacks on the media, figurative or literal, are very real. And so when the Acosta had his White House press credentials revoked recently, actually my outlet, the Religion News Service, joined the amicus brief in his defense. And that's not a thing that would normally happen under a different presidency. But I will note that your criticisms, the ones that you outlined, are not new, and I think that people have been lobbing them for some time, and it's been kind of awkward for a lot of journalists, because we're like, wait, we have to be cool about CNN now? We were the ones who picked on them all these years. Like, we were the ones who were the chief critics. And I think Daniel knows that I mean that in jest, but like, we're used to having conversations among journalists of holding each other accountable and be like, that's rough. And they've still happened since then. And I think that what's interesting about this moment is that it is certainly widely perceived that the intensity of the attacks in the media, because again, the president continues to set the media, set the tone for the rest of the country, becomes the story. And the critiques that we had been talking about for some time, which is about the first culture, as it were, and whether or not some journalism is done even remotely fairly or adequately, have taken a back burner because it feels like the Fourth Estate itself is under threat. And I do that is a tension that if it helps, that I have heard discussed among numerous journalists, where it's like, I'm going to defend you. I want your right to exist. I really don't think that your entire outlet is fake news, but also that thing you did last Wednesday was messed up, and we need to talk about it. And I think those two conversations are happening in tandem. I just think the average American isn't going to hear the internal journalist discourse, if that makes any sense.
Can I just add to that question? So I work freelance. I haven't been in a newsroom in 10 or 12 years. I live outside the country, so I'm actually kind of curious too about this. So what's the conversation like internally in the newsroom, say at CNN right now? This whole idea, like, do we have to reflexively react to everything that Trump does, or is there pushback? And when you're talking to executives, is it really just, hey, we're all struggling, it's a super fractured media landscape, there aren't just 5 credible centrist news sources anymore, it's so atomized, everyone's going to confirm their own bias, that sort of thing. So is it really just come down to economics to being able to stay afloat as a business? What's the answer to that?
I don't think so. That's definitely not a conversation that we have in the newsroom about the economics. I think it's more like, do we have to cover that tweet? Should we cover every tweet that he does? Some of them, are legit. They're national security, they're his administration. He announces firings on Twitter, but some of them are just sort of culture war issues that don't seem to be extremely relevant to what's going on. It's also sort of a question of, as John was saying, like Trump eating all the oxygen in the room and just sort of like consuming every other story, consuming all of our attention. And I think that's something that actually we talk about quite a bit. How to get your story played, how to get it on air or get it on digital, how to get an audience for it without a Trump angle. So yeah, those conversations are happening quite a bit. It'll be interesting to see what happens in 2020. I'm really going to be curious about how we cover that race. In some ways, it's going to be already beginning, right? But if we thought the midterms were intense, it's going to be ugly.
I think that, I wish that CNN, maybe there was more conversation about the money aspect of this and what money is being made, because CNN has made a lot of money out of Trump and sort of out of the circus around Trump, and so has the Washington Post and the New York Times and lots of other outlets. And there is a serious moral hazard here of playing into that. And I think from the Trump point of view, Jim Acosta is a very useful foil, and I haven't seen the public opinion surveys on this, but I think it probably helped the president as much as it helped the press. And so, why is it that we get into situations like that? And I think Claudia's point about lack of context and too much of the reporting, I think actually a lot of the really top-tier editors and journalists that I know and that we deal with, I think they're pretty fully bought into the resistance and the us against them, and this is how they see what they're doing in terms of the main goal is to bring Trump down. And I have a lot of issues with the way this president is governing the country, but I have a deep concern, fear that the way that the media is going about its role vis-a-vis this president is doing grave damage to the institution of the press that we're going to be living with for years after Trump.
Eric, you're up.
Hi, Eric Owens from Boston College. I was wondering if you might speak a bit about your mission, your personal mission as journalists, and how it relates to the mission of the organizations you work with. Intention, perhaps, in perfect coincidence, perhaps. I can imagine truth-telling, or perhaps saving American democracy, or telling the stories of neglected persons, or perhaps bringing us together again through fractured politics, or breaking us apart into other stronger factions than we are. But I'd love to hear it from yourselves about what drives you in your work on a meta level, and how that relates to your to the landscape in which you work, especially your employers and the people who publish the work you write. Thanks.
And again, this is for the whole panel, right? Sure. Any order? This is the large meta question.
Yeah.
On each of our pitch sheets, when my team has a circle up every 2 weeks or so, there's a box that's sort of like, how is this story going to move the needle? And that is our overall editor's favorite way to talk about having a real life impact on the world. And so I think in his mind, you're supposed to say something like, we'll get this frustrating policy overturned. We'll get lawmakers to pay more attention to a certain issue. We'll get our readers to really mobilize around some vulnerable group in our community or nation. But I think I maybe frustrate them a little bit in that my move the needle thought is always just let's understand the world a little better. Let's have better conversations about complicated issues. Let's acknowledge nuance that's there when we're so used to just shouting at each other, whether in person or online. And so picking up that idea of like, what resistance am I part of as a journalist? It's really just this world of short attention spans that we're in right now. I want to write stories that make people excited to learn and help them understand the world a little bit better.
I'll note there's a lot of different ways to do that, and Kelsey has been amazing about working with data in the last year and a half. You've done some really amazing, I've learned things from all of your articles. But like, for me, it comes down to informing the public, exposing things, and shining a spotlight on those that others would ignore. Because and I say that more particularly from my position as a journalist, because there are certain journalists who need to cover the thing that everyone knows about, right? They need to be the first, they need to be the record, if that makes any sense, of things that are definitely going to occur. And that, the White House, like press corps, as it were, they're there to ask the hard questions in front of everyone and, while they are televised, et cetera. There's a whole other layer of journalism, which is to tease out and spotlight groups that aren't in that room to begin with and likely won't be covered if you don't send a journalist to talk to them. And so for me, in addition to the inform and expose elements, which I think are classic journalistic traits, I want to make sure that I am able to tell stories that others will not tell, because that's the particular privilege of a journalist, is to have access to certain spaces and be able to have conversations with certain people that, quite frankly, most people either wouldn't be able to do, or it would be really awkward if you tried to talk to them in those spaces. And so that's the privilege that we get. And for me, that gets me up in the morning.
Yeah, so there's an exhibit based on the Buddha at a museum in Washington, D.C. And the last line of it is these words on the screen. It says, "Ignorance fuels suffering." And I think we see that. We've seen social science data that that's true, that people are more likely to attack a Muslim, for example, if they don't actually know any Muslims or don't know anything about Islam. The converse is true as well. They're more likely to have a positive view if they do know a Muslim or do know something about Islam. Part of my job, I think, is to inform, to help those conversations, to help inform people around the world about particular religious ideas, particular religious people. I try not to overcomplicate that. I think I'm lucky enough to work for a place that has resources to send me to places. So I go there and I bear witness and I tell people what's going on there. And I don't try to overcomplicate it with takes. I don't do a lot of analysis. I don't want to do that stuff. You won't see me popping up on air as a talking head a lot. I'm much more interested in going to the place and writing about it and learning what the story is. There are times when you have to pop out and you have to do other sorts of pieces, but like that is my main focus. And I feel, like Jack said, I feel an honor to be able to do that.
The only thing I'd add to that is for us, I second everything that everybody said, and I really appreciate hearing that. We really, for the Pulitzer Center, we think of it as our mission as being global engagement and trying to facilitate this kind of civil discourse that we think is increasingly lacking, and prompting that. And it happens that, in our view, we think that journalism is the absolute best means for making that kind of conversation happen, if it's good journalism, if it's the sort of work that Jason and the folks up here have been describing do. If we can get that out into classrooms and to community groups, and particularly if we can get it to groups that represent diverse sets of opinion that have not already gone off into their individual silos, we might get out of this deep rut that we're currently in. So that I think of as our mission.
For me, I think when I got into journalism, I knew very early on that I wanted to sort of work the margins. I grew up in D.C. My first internship was in Washington, and for some people that was really the summit, and I couldn't get out of town fast enough, and I took off for West Africa, and that was the beginning of a long road that's still going. But yeah, early on, when I first heard about the Pulitzer Center, I knew I had to work with these guys because the values, this idea of underreported stories and shining a light in dark places, that was something that really struck a chord with me. And I grew up only child. Father was a immigrant from Iran. I found out in my 20s that he was an illegal immigrant. And so maybe something in the DNA there. But for me, a lot of growing up was observing, listening, trying to reconcile sort of different realities. And I think that carried over into my work as a journalist. So yeah, I mean, trying to affect consciousness, as best we can. There's a lot out there that's vying for our attention. The U.S. kind of feels like a dumpster fire right now, and for those of us, out doing foreign news, it feels really hard to get anything through the smoke, and it's just getting harder, and a lot of really good journalists are having to call it quits because there's just not enough interest, not enough support. So, we need allies in doing this. But yeah, I think for me, it's just kind of always boiled down to finding a way to bridge what might seem like an unbridgeable gulf, helping people, relate to the struggles of a dark Muslim Rohingya person on the other side of the world, and maybe they don't even know where Myanmar is on a map, but I think just trying to imbue stories with a little more feeling and trying to bridge that gap is, it's a constant struggle, and sometimes you barely feel like you're scratching the surface, but that's what drives me.
Moving to this side of the room.
Thank you. Thank you for all of your thoughtfulness. I want to raise an issue about belief, because it seems to me that journalists often do not, as I think is kind of common parlance in our culture, do not push people about what they really believe. And this gets to the subtext issue or the politics and religion issue. When you talk about Buddhists and the Rohingya, and I want to say, what do those Buddhists really believe? Are they Buddhists? And how can they justify, on the basis of their belief, which they are presenting, I am a believer, and therefore, genocide? How can they do that when Franklin Graham says, well, he claims that he didn't have these affairs, so, what do you really believe, Franklin? What do you really, really believe? And are you following a Jesus whose main concern was the rich giving their money to the poor? Where is that discourse? And what are you saying you believe when you pretend to believe? There's a wonderful discussion that Daniel Dennett has about the difference between believing in God and believing in belief, which might be very interesting. Not that I'm trying to suggest that one or the other is better, but just that we so seldom go to the point of making ourselves distinguish. And so the pretext gets, freely given, and we're not pushing in a way that makes people say why, and clarify their contradictions between what they pretend they believe and the way that they are acting. And I would love to see the Pulitzer Center take up that issue and move us beyond what is just, common parlance, that we don't say anything bad about what people believe or get too pushy about it. And so we let all of that irrational context stay entirely irrational and just pretend that it's okay when it's not.
Sure. Yeah, that's a good question. Thank you. And I guess I could sort of address it in the context of the Rohingya. Yeah, I mean, you see the victims of this sort of communal violence, and it splits you open. You know, how could this happen, and how could it be either accepted, fanned, or dismissed as fake news, which is a huge phenomenon in a place like Myanmar right now. They've weaponized social media, and that's driving a lot of this. So people are in utter denial about what's happening. To answer something like that, I mean, I don't know what's in the hearts of men and women really, but to begin to try and address that, I mean, that's really nuanced. It's nuanced and complex, and it involves going back to colonial history and before, and how these countries have interplayed with each other, and current politics and economics. And I think at the root, more often than not, it's fear. It's fear of losing identity. And in Burma, this is a hyper-diverse place. It's very resource-rich, but there's a lot of crabs in the bucket. People are fighting over these things. And when the country was liberalizing, this lid was ripped off, and these currents that have been festering for a long time were unleashed. And there are people who have very cynically manipulated them for political gain, for profit. And there are other people, who may be very orthodox and feel that, the Buddhist identity, which has defined the country going back for hundreds of years, is under threat of being erased. And so they peddle these existential threat narratives in the country. And because of who they are and their stature, it gets currency. They have a lot of clout. That's what we're up against as journalists, because we're asked to distill all of this. And, doctoral theses, books, I mean, all these things, barely get at it, and we're trying to do this within the span of, 800, if I'm lucky, maybe 5,000 words. And there's just not an interest. So in the end, you do your best to shade everything, but so often it feels really like you're just parroting cliches and caricatures of people and the values they represent. I think we all feel very frustrated by this, but this is like the reality of the news business, and there's this sort of stock assumption that, there's not an appetite for that kind of nuance, and we can't. I mean, with exceptions, but I'm speaking generally, and I'm seeing a trend towards more oversimplification than ever. That's at least what I'm facing, and I do more slow-cooked, long-form reportage, documentaries, long-form magazine stories. So I feel like I've got a better crack at it, but I'm invariably dissatisfied with what I'm putting out on that end. So yeah, I think it's a conversation, between news organizations, foundations. I know the journalists want it, but then also the public. The public has to demand more, like you.
I will note, in the American context, kind of the questions you're bringing up around Franklin Graham and others, I'll admit that as someone who specializes in religion and politics, I have it a little bit easier here, because I think what's beneath your question is actually something I think religion reporters in particular wrestle with a lot, which is that you ask somebody about their faith, they give you the answer, and at some point you just have to trust what they say at some level. But in the religion and politics space, I get to ask a whole lot of follow-up questions, because the political journalism approach is to ask those difficult questions, to ask about contradictions, to push somebody. And so, I've been lucky in that, when I'm talking to a political figure or a religious figure who operates in the political space, it's more acceptable to ask those hard questions, making them name aspects of their faith and be like, well, you said this, but you also said this, and those two things don't seem to go together theologically. And it's acceptable there. But when I do, raw religion stories that aren't necessarily connected to politics, it is a lot harder, because you can push somebody only so far before it seems to be that it can easily be interpreted as that your inquisitiveness is attacking their faith. And even if you feel it's abhorrent, and even if you feel that it's, actively opposed to who, me as a journalist is as a person, the question of faith is that, and belief is that, you probe as deep as you can, and then you take their word for it. And then you can talk to them and say, the things you just said don't match up with the things you do, but at some point, belief and faith is rooted in someone's profession thereof. And I think balancing that in the context of a story where you might say, look, this is what someone says, this is the theological beliefs that they profess, this is what they preach to their congregations. I do have to note that this is some things they actually did in the real world, and I think I haven't seen many of my colleagues who've shied away from being able to do both of those things. But I do think, I'll defer to y'all, but I do think that's a tension we wrestle with a lot, is how to not come off as actually hostile to a faith and a tradition when also just trying to get to the truth.
This is just to come back for a moment to the Myanmar case, and this is just a thought, but it seems to me that there's a story, an angle on this that hasn't been taken that might get at the question that you're raising, and it has to do with Aung San Suu Kyi and her role, and the people who know her in our country who are know her well over many years, and she is someone who is very sophisticated, very knowledgeable. I doubt that she buys into the simplistic storyline, sort of the fake news that's presented in Myanmar. How does she reconcile what's happened with her own beliefs? And I think we haven't done enough of that kind of reporting, sort of holding to account. We tried to do a little bit of it with the project we did with Politico on the Obama policy, that sort of Ben Rhodes and what he was doing, what others high up in the White House were doing. But I think there are people who actually know her well that could speak to just the kind of question you're talking about. It hasn't been done.
Yeah, I would just say that, I push all of my sources on their beliefs all the time. You don't necessarily see that in the copy, but I'm asking them questions, particularly when it diverges from mainstream interpretations of their religion. I will ask them about that quite a bit, and if there are discrepancies, then I will mention that as well. You saw that with the Jeff Sessions case. I don't think anyone in the media just allowed Jeff Sessions to say the Bible supports separating children at the border and left it at that. That's not how that went down. A lot of people were doing stories about that Bible passage, how that Bible passage fits with others that talk about welcoming the stranger. So I think that's good advice, and we should keep doing that, but we are doing that as well.
Hi, I ask a question as a colleague, not a religion scholar. I know some of you, but I'm Lori Goodstein. I write for the New York Times. And I was really struck by something you said, Jason. I think I got it right, that you said that you were in Myanmar and you were focusing on the opening of that country and how unprecedented that was, and that you didn't see the genocide coming. Did I get that right? Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering if you, and also the U.S.-based reporters on the panel, I think in some ways there's a parallel with the Trump election. He was saying things that seemed so extreme, so out of the box, were so insulting to so many people that many did not see that coming either. So I'm wondering if there are lessons that you have or reflections that you can help us avoid that happening again in your various contexts. And I struggle with this because in some ways some of what's happened is because of people in the very extremes or in the very margins who have then kind of been moved to the center, but then do you give them the mic or is ignoring what they're saying the danger itself?
I can start. I think there were signs that this was brewing, and I'm no Burma expert. I was new to the country. I know there are people who probably were aware of what could happen sooner than later, who were tracking. That's not to say, a couple of years ago we didn't see where this was going. I mean, I think the concentration camps you saw on the West Coast were a really strong emblem of what was happening and where this could go if not checked. And so there was a lot of reporting in those intervening years trying to confront the UN about their apologetics on behalf of the government and what's the calculus here. And it was always, we don't want to press too hard, because we don't want to be kicked out of the country. It's a fickle government, and we're trying to play the long game here. Meanwhile, the government would double down, or there'd be another atrocity, and it was still the same line. And then you'd see this turn internally where, and privately, where people would say, yeah, we know this is awful and crimes have been committed, and these are essentially war criminals behind the scenes. But publicly, there was that disconnect. They would posture, well, we're not going to confront them directly. And I think they played Western countries in the UN very savvily in that regard. And I think Suu Kyi, in a way, was sort of a false target. I mean, she definitely has a moral authority in the country, and she's failed completely. But she doesn't have any real power in that country at this point in time. And she's out of her depth. And so, she's taking all the flack, but really it's this military government that did sort of a bait and switch and is still very much having their cake and eating it too, profiting hand over fist in the periphery of the country while maintaining this veneer of an emerging democracy. So I think the violence we saw last year, the genocide, it didn't need to happen. It could have been stopped. It definitely could have been stopped. And so I'm not sure there's much more. It's made me very cynical seeing what I saw, because it did happen again, and it was on everybody's watch. I'd like to know.
In this political moment in the U.S., what I've been thinking a lot about is my own social network, the beliefs of and backgrounds of the people who sit around me in my newsroom, the people I follow on my Twitter, the background of my own just regular friends that I see all the time, and realizing where I fall short in a diversity sense. Just wanting to hear more from people of different political backgrounds, from different areas of the country, with different, maybe especially academic backgrounds, who didn't go to a place like Yale Divinity School and then learn a certain way of thinking about religion and consuming news a certain way. So since the election in 2016, I've tried to be more careful with my social media, following more people, keeping people around even when they might annoy me with their takes on certain issues, just because I think I got too comfortable assuming that my own network's view of the world was everybody's view of the world, and I need to have folks on my Twitter feed who are interpreting situations totally differently than I do.
So I really struggle with that as well. Just this past week at the U.S. Catholic Bishops' Conference, there was a rally basically across the street from the hotel, by a pretty virulently anti-gay organization. A couple hundred people there. It was a news event. They were there to protest serious things within the Catholic Church, but I had to think really hard about whether to offer that group a space within CNN to get across their ideas, or to present their ideas in a sort of watered-down way to get within CNN in the first place. The danger of that, just to bring it to a personal story, I was in a cab one time in New York City where a guy, we started talking about 9/11 for some reason. He said he didn't think it happened because he saw Jesse Ventura on CNN put forth that theory that it didn't happen. It always struck with me that how we offer the microphone to people really does have a real-life impact on what people believe. So I tend to be maybe too cautious in terms of not giving extremists a microphone. But I wrestle with that almost with every story. I wrestled with that quite a bit last week about how to cover that, whether to cover that. It's sort of a case-by-case thing, but yeah, I think you're right. Part of the problem is that you're sort of asking for prophetic reporting, right? What are you missing? Like, what is the story ahead? That's always hard to do, isn't it?
I want to just come back to something that's a point we've made several times here in the course of this conversation about the need for serious reporting and engaged reporting all around the world. And I'm thinking about the coverage of Saudi Arabia, the Yemen war, Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince, and we've done 6 or 8 different projects on the Yemen war going back to 2015, when, because as you know, it was that our role was begun by the Obama administration, not by the Trump administration. And it's been well known, just the enormity of the bad things that have happened in Yemen. And we've also done projects on the suppression of dissidents and the mass arrest in Saudi Arabia. And yet, 6 months ago, when bin Salman came to the United States, he got, was lionized in his coverage in the media, and he was, welcomed with, warm embrace by not just the Jared Kushner and Donald Trump, but by Mike Bloomberg and the Democratic leadership of Congress and Tim Cook and the lords of Silicon Valley. And it was just this great beacon of reform. That's just bad reporting. And we let down our readers. We let down the public. I mean, I started the Pulitzer Center in 2005 because I had just spent 4 years mostly in the Middle East and Muslim countries and just despaired of how we had marched in lockstep from 9/11 on into this totally misbegotten, enormous failure of a war on no evidence. And yet the New York Times and the Washington Post and Bill and Hillary Clinton and the Congress on both parties, the Brookings Institution, they were all for it. And we just, and the media discovered that absent a strong political opposition, we weren't very good at fostering the kind of debate that we like to pretend that we create. And I want us to take that role seriously and not just wait for somebody in resistance to whoever is in power at the moment to give us our marching orders and we echo that. I want us to play the role of surfacing multiple points of view and robust, honest debate about policies that end up affecting a lot of people in this country and around the world.
So I don't think you're doing this, but I think the media beats itself up too much about not calling the 2016 election because the math gave the probability to Hillary Clinton, period, end of sentence. And if the math had given the probability to Donald Trump, we probably would have had a different conversation. What I think is undergirding this concern is that what drove his campaign and what he capitalized on in a political context, I think, wasn't necessarily unexpected. It was just the fact that he got enough voters that you can fit inside of a baseball field, and that allowed him extra in 3 different states, and that allowed him to take the presidential election. But I mean, I don't think the media did a poor job of covering, for instance, that there was a rise in Islamophobia. I mean, like in my old job, at Think Progress, I tracked over the course of a year 100 different incidences of anti-Muslim sentiment across the country. And a lot of other outlets did the same thing. I think people definitely were tracking the anti-immigrant sentiment because as much as, during the child migrant crisis in 2015 along the border, and Ted Cruz and Glenn Beck went down there and gave toys to children, right behind them were groups of militia men who were going to stay near the border, who are back there now, by the way. They followed the military down there. And, Church Militant actually got a few articles around them, talking about this weird upstart group. And I think what has been interesting to me is that the only thing that I think the media missed was that, it was in the area, the region of probability that Donald Trump could win. But there was no scenario where he didn't get 46, 47, 48, 49% of the vote. And those people were going to vote for him regardless. And so I've been really fascinated by the soul searching that this has done for the American media because I don't think it's that the media has missed this shift towards nationalism, towards anti-immigrant rhetoric, towards Islamophobia. I think they just didn't think it could win. And obviously in a democratic society like ours, that makes a huge difference because if it can win, then that sentiment is given power. But for me, I don't think that the media missed the phenomenon. I think all of the articles were there. I just think the conclusion was one that they missed. And so if there's a lesson I learned from that, it's don't stop covering those extreme pieces. And there is a very real balance of false equivalence where you don't want to say, Every time you write about racism, you have to go call the KKK member and say, look, what do you think about race? Like that's false equivalency. But I do think there's a way that the media has actually already, a path that the media has already blazed, which is you don't ignore these elements. And you definitely don't ignore when they grab political power. And I think we just need to learn that there's a real chance that they can win at the end of the day. And that's a hard lesson for both reporters and I think pollsters alike.
Thank you.
I'm terribly sorry, but I think we've run out of time. So I want to thank our panelists for this really illuminating and thoughtful, insightful discussion. So can we have a round of applause for them?